Week 5 is in the books, and we have some dynasty lessons and observations that we need to learn from and recap from this past week of football. So let's get right into the video. So like I said, there are some dynasty observations and lessons that we can learn from this past week, and there are 4 of them that I have identified for this video. So let's move into that first one here. Get set into first down, and welcome back, Robert Woods. I missed you. We missed you. The fantasy community and all of us missed you being in our fantasy lives, and welcome back because after 3 weeks outside the top 45 and another week at wide receiver 28, Robert Woods came through for us for fantasy managers with a 27-point wide receiver 8 fantasy point production this past week on Thursday night. And the hope now is, or at least for myself and probably a lot of other fellow Robert Woods managers out there, is that this production that we saw and the split between Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp continues as it has in the past, as we've seen just from years past in 2018, 2019, 2020, and then again now, like what we saw Thursday night from this past week. Surprisingly enough, though, this is not the first time that Matthew Stafford has hyper-targeted one wide receiver to start the season. I mean, back in 2016, Matt Stafford got a new wide receiver named Marvin Jones in the first season right after Calvin Johnson retired. Before 2016, though, Golden Tate, the main PPR guy in that Detroit Lions offense, had 2 straight 130 plus target and 90 reception plus seasons as the PPR receiver to Calvin Johnson's deep field big play threat. But to start the 2016 season, however, through the first 4 games, Marvin Jones averaged 9 targets, 6 receptions, 120 yards, and 0.5 touchdowns for a pace of 20 fantasy points per game, compared to Golden Tate through those first 4 games, averaging only 6 targets, 3 receptions, 20 yards, and 0 touchdowns with 6.2 fantasy points per game. However, then from week 5 on, for the rest of 2016, those averages basically flipped back into Golden Tate's favor, who now averaged 16 points per game versus Marvin Jones 8 points per game for the remainder of 2016. And actually a very similar thing happened again the following year in 2017, with Tate starting out super hot, starting the year with over 13 fantasy points per game, and Marvin Jones being under the double-digit mark, to then that being flipped to where now Golden Tate was averaging 14 points per game and Marvin Jones was averaging 16 points per game. So I don't think that the flip and the switch in points per game and production for Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods would be as drastic as what we saw in 2016 with Golden Tate and Marvin Jones, where one wide receiver was hot and very usable and great for fantasy to start the year, but then that switched and the other wide receiver became the main PPR and fantasy producer to finish out the year in 2016. I think it would be much closer to what we saw in 2017, where one of those wide receivers started out super hot. In that case, it was Golden Tate. In this case, it was Cooper Kupp. But then that basically evened out much more out throughout the rest of the year, where then now they both averaged 14 and 16 fantasy points per game. And I think that would be much closer to what we could see and predict from Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. And I really hope that the Thursday night game brought that memory back into Matthew Stafford of, hey, remember when I had 2 wide receivers that were very similar to this, and that one guy who was the PPR guy was still really good to throw to? Hopefully he remembers that, and hopefully Sean McVay remembers how good their offense is when both Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods are seeing targets and getting production simultaneously, and that would be really, really good for us for fantasy football. Moving down into second down and continuing with the wide receiver position, it is past time that we start figuring out Mike Williams' dynasty value, because he has been on absolute fire to start the year. He's the current wide receiver 3. He has 2 top 5 weeks, 2 other top 15 weeks, and then one really weird dud game on Monday Night Football just a couple weeks ago, where most of the production went to Jared Cook and Donald Parham and not Mike Williams or Keenan Allen. So that was one really dud week. But outside of that week, he has been absolutely fantastic for fantasy football, including what he just did this past week in week 5 that might have won you guys some leagues and some weeks this week if you started Mike Williams. So figuring out where he needs to be valued at in Dynasty is actually kind of the tricky part, because on one hand, it looks like he's taking over as the wide receiver 1 for the LA Chargers. He's the big play receiver, which means that he's getting, the air yards and the targets that we love for fantasy. That is making him so good right now, is those big chunk plays, the big play touchdowns, long balls, all of that good stuff for fantasy. he is getting all of that right now and not Keenan Allen. And he is attached to, of course, one of the best young quarterbacks in the league right now in Justin Herbert. A fantastic offense, coach, system, all of that great stuff is just all coming together for Mike Williams in this breakout season in 2021. But on the other hand, though, he's 27 years old. He just turned 27 actually on October 4th. So he'll be 28 years old at this time next year because math. And that is not an age that we love in Dynasty for wide receivers. That 28-year-old mark is basically the mark where we say no matter what you do from here on out, you are never going to really gain in value. We saw it with Julio Jones, Adam Thielen, Keenan Allen, and Allen Robinson are starting to see it a little bit now. Same with Mike Evans and Amari Cooper. That is just the age where we start favoring a lot of rookies and sophomore wide receivers over those veterans just because we have 5, 6, 7 more years of age on them that we don't have to worry about the downfall for those other wide receivers as they hit and peak over that 30-year-old mark. So he will be 28 years old next year, so that is something to watch for. He is also a very rare fifth-year breakout that we're seeing right now, much like Devontae Parker, Corey Davis in just past years. So that production that we've seen from the other guys has been kind of unstable. It hasn't really held true over the following years for Devontae Parker very specifically. Corey Davis has been pretty solid, but still not as great as what we saw him be last year with Ryan Tannehill on this new Jets team. So is that production for Mike Williams sustainable moving forward through the remainder of 2021 and then also 2022, 2023 years on down the road for him? Not to mention the fact that he is also an unrestricted free agent at the end of this year. So it's actually entirely possible that while he's connected to Justin Herbert in this awesome Chargers offense now, he might actually sign somewhere else in free agency if the Chargers don't want him back or if somebody else is willing to pay him more. So he might not be on a good team. He might not have a good quarterback throwing in the ball. Maybe he's not even the team's wide receiver one like we're seeing him take over for Keenan Allen on the Chargers now. So that all is a lot of risk that is coming into Mike Williams' dynasty value outside of him being really fantastic for fantasy football right now. So bringing all that together, looking at September DLF ADP and where we had wide receivers, I think it's very safe to throw him between wide receiver 15 and wide receiver 20 because that is where a lot of other 27 and 28-year-old wide receivers were to start the year. Guys like Mike Evans, Allen Robinson, Amari Cooper were all in that range to start the 2021 season. So if we're looking forward for the rest of this year into next year, I think that's a pretty safe bet on where to place Mike Williams for this current dynasty value right now. And it's really going to come down to, Mike Williams versus Amari Cooper and Mike Evans, like I already mentioned, Cooper Kupp, Jerry Jeudy, Deontay Johnson, and maybe even potentially guys like Deebo Samuel and Marquise Hollywood Brown, who are having absolute fantastic starts to their seasons as well. Do those wide receivers start to creep up into this kind of wide receiver 2 territory on top of all the other guys that we've already had in that range, and nothing's really changed for them to make them go any farther up or any farther down, that they would stay in that range with Mike Williams as well. So I think having him in that range is certainly very safe. I'm very comfortable with all that, and that does make his value at least a high future first, if not a future first and second, if you're trying to trade for him or kind of cash out and trade him away right now if you don't necessarily need his value. So I think that's where I'm very comfortable sticking Mike Williams and his current dynasty value, given the potential free agency and age risk, but then also valuing really heavily what he is currently doing right now and how awesome he's been for fantasy football and for your starting lineups. So next then we get into third down, and we have seen for 2 straight weeks now that running back Michael Carter is leading the Jets in both snaps, touches, opportunities, and is basically taking over that backfield more and more every single week. And what started as a 3-headed monster back in week 1 between Carter, Ty Johnson, and Tevin Coleman has now basically turned into a 65-35 split between Carter and Ty Johnson, with Tevin Coleman just becoming more and more friendly with that bench on the sideline. So over the last 2 weeks, Carter has seen 29 opportunities on 60 snaps to Ty Johnson's 12 opportunities on 42 snaps. So more and more, this is just becoming Carter's backfield every single week. And so unfortunately for him, though, he is on the New York Jets, and he hasn't been all that great with his opportunities, totaling 34 and 58 total yards in each of the last 2 games, albeit he has scored in each of those last 2 games, which has really saved his fantasy performances and fantasy days, even though he hasn't been all that efficient, and he really isn't that much of a PPR kind of guy, averaging only about 2 to 3 targets per game. that touchdown and that touchdown opportunities is really where the main source of his fantasy production has been coming from over the last 2 weeks. But I mean, even Le'Veon Bell was not that good with the New York Jets. Other running backs really haven't been good with the New York Jets because, again, it's the New York Jets and they're not that good. So I would expect that their running back would not be that good, especially because they're just not having to run all that much and abandon the run game because they suck. It is what it is, and that's where we are with Michael Carter. So finally, we get into 4th down, and sticking with the rookie running backs here, we move to San Francisco, where the memorial for the death of Trey Sermon's hopes and dreams has begun because, in all seriousness, Trey Sermon is not a thing. I'm sorry. He's just not a thing. He's not going to be a thing. And I get it. You were excited that he went to San Francisco on day 2 in the NFL draft in round 3. He even had a touchdown in week 3. He had almost 90 rushing yards in week 4. But Trey Sermon is not the guy that Kyle Shanahan wants to lead this offense. It's Elijah Mitchell. And we saw that this past week because there was hope that Sermon would reclaim the starting job after Elijah Mitchell got hurt. And people wanted to see how Shanahan would utilize the two of them when Mitchell returns to action after pretty solid performances from Trey Sermon over the last 2 weeks without Elijah Mitchell. How would that backfield split shake out in that very first week? Well, I'll tell you, because Elijah Mitchell played 44 snaps, had 11 touches, and Trey Sermon had 1 touch on 2 snaps. 2 snaps. So I'm sorry for all of y'all who took Trey Sermon in the first round of your rookie drafts. I did my best to try to stop y'all. I never got Trey Sermon. I never understood the love. I was always on board with Elijah Mitchell over Trey Sermon. I thought it was very much like how Aaron Jones was better than Jamal Williams when the Packers drafted both of them in the same draft back in 2017. I never understood the Trey Sermon thing, and maybe this is a way too early of a victory lap, but I never got it. And it's just, you know, I'm sorry to all of y'all who had Trey Sermon and were really, really hopeful for him. He's just not going to be a thing, and it's time to sell out and time to get off of him now. And I would venture to bet that someone out there in every single one of your dynasty leagues that you have Trey Sermon, someone out there in your league would definitely give you a second on him still, because they would see that as kind of a discount on potentially what you had paid for him in rookie drafts, and they would still hold out hope that this is a rookie running back that you're just selling on too quickly and they could just recoup some value for a 2nd round pick. I would bet that there are other managers in all of your dynasty leagues that would be willing to do that for a 2nd round pick, or maybe someone, I don't know, would give you like Zach Moss or Jamal Williams, or honestly even Kenneth Gainwell at this point. Take almost whatever you can get that's pretty solid value for Trey Sermon and get out, because honestly, if you wait for him to become the next Keyshawn Vaughn, then you're going to have nothing. Keyshawn Vaughn is literally on every waiver wire in every single dynasty league. He's worth nothing right now, not even a 4th round pick. And if you wait for Trey Sermon to fall that far, it's already done. It's over and done with, and you can't get anything for him. So sell out now, even if it's at a horrible return on what you paid for him in your rookie drafts. Just get out now before the bottom completely falls out of Trey Sermon's value. Just please, please, please get out on Trey Sermon. And if you'd like to watch a video with more of a recap and weekly observations from this past week in week 5 of the NFL season in 2021, you can click right up here and watch that video. And with that all being said, guys, thank you all so much for watching. We will catch y'all later.